Oh boy, I'm out of practice. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. I accidentally took a month off YouTube. That wasn't in the plan. You guys know how it is. Deadlines happen and then you've got some other stuff you need to take care of. I completely redid my entire workroom, so now everything is different. I had a bunch of sewing projects that I wanted finished. We were painting. I had a small nervous breakdown. You know, stuff happened. But that's fine, we're back now. And I wanted a nice, straightforward video to edit that wasn't going to be a whole load of sewing footage. The YouTube algorithm, in its infinite wisdom, served up to me this video. Most common types of medieval clothes or garments, medieval misconceptions. This video is on a channel called Shadiversity, which has 1.21 million subscribers. 237,000 people have seen this video. Now, I haven't watched anything else on Shad's channel. I have had a bit of a look, and it looks like he mainly does military history and weaponry and fighting styles and stuff like that, so not a costume historian, but I thought it would be fun to just have a bit of a look, see what kind of things he talks about, and maybe we'll learn some things along the way. Full disclaimer, I am also not a costume historian, and I am in fact not even particularly a medieval expert, but I am a costumer of like 15 years now. I've picked up a few things. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
And in this video, it's my intention to try and break down some of the classic types of medieval garments so you can know and have a bit of a reference that you can look at as to what are they called, because that's actually been a difficult thing for me to figure out. The tricky thing is, what I have also found, is that a lot of these names have a decent amount of overlap where one garment could easily be identified as one or the other.
One of the first things he talks about is that it's quite hard to identify which garments are which. There seems to be a lot of overlap. There's one garment going by different names. There's different garments being called the same name. Yeah. That's a thing. That is a massive thing in costume history. Very similar looking garments are called different things in different time periods or even just different regions. What a particular garment is called can evolve over time. So at the beginning of the century it can be called one thing and by the end of the century it's called something else entirely. Equally, we might be using the same word for 150 years, but the actual what it looks like is going to change every 20, 30, 50 years. Or less as you get further down, closer to the modern day. But in the medieval period, especially where we don't have as many primary sources for clothing, there's very, very little surviving actual clothing from the European medieval period. It's really hard. I'm with you in that one. This is just incredibly difficult.
And so we'll start with the undergarment, and honestly you could just call it that, okay? You could just call it an undergarment, but another word is shirt. Yeah.
Again, so far so good. I feel like people recently have really got their head around the idea of body linens, a washable garment you wear next to your skin so you don't have to wash your outer garments very often. We're all kind of getting on board with that. Shirt is a completely fine word. I'm assuming that he's using the words that were used in English, or at least in England. If you go into other parts of Europe, you get some other regional words, which I only speak English. Shad speaks English. We're going with English.
Now, the other thing about the shirt being the undergarment is that if they're short, they can be longer, it varies, okay?
Yes, also correct. Shirts can be longer or a bit shorter. There's a little bit of argument about how kind of shorter shirts actually should be. There's a lot of arguments in medieval costuming because we don't have a lot to go on. Having said that, it is generally, particularly if you are wearing male dress, better to have something that comes somewhere between your kind of mid-thigh to knee length. You don't really want it shorter than that, and you don't really want it longer than that. You don't really want it shorter than that because unless you're wearing brays, which you might be, if you're not wearing brays, it's completely acceptable to only wear the shirt and have that tucked between your legs and protecting everything that it needs to protect. And if you make it much longer than that, it's not going to fit into your trousers or hose because you're not going to wear it loose, you're going to tuck it in. If you are wearing women's clothing of the period, different story. Probably be like below knee, if not longer. I tend to make mine just above the knee, so I have that flexibility of going one way or the other because I don't know what gender I'm going to feel like on any given day.
There absolutely were fashion differences between men and women in the medieval period, but the length of the garment wasn't actually one of them for a large portion, okay?
Okay, yes. Yes and no. Yes, medieval men wore long garments, particularly medieval elite men wore long garments as a sign of wealth and status. You had more fabric, you were wearing a slightly more impractical garment. And I'd say slightly because, as many LARPers have discovered, and indeed as it seems Chad also discovered for himself, you can do quite a lot in a dress, including fight. Women didn't really wear shorter garments. Women's clothing in general was long. It was at the very least below the knees, but more likely ankle length, and this is true for pretty much the entire medieval period. And for some styles in some regions, fashionable or elite women would be wearing extremely long trains as well. Women's garments didn't go shorter. Men had options, women didn't. But yes, this is one of the reasons that I particularly like the medieval period, is that the difference between men and women's kit is a little bit more nuanced and based on where you belt it, what you've done with your headgear, that kind of thing. Just gives you a little bit more flexibility. I really enjoy that.
And that's because they actually can fit a larger range of sizes. Pants, to work functionally, generally need to be tighter fit, and if they're not tight, they're going to fall down, which means you need a belt to hold them up.
Shad, that is not a medieval pair of trousers, but I'm sure we'll get onto trousers later. Broadly, there were a lot of looser fitting garments that could be adjusted to fit a wide range of sizes. The more money that you had, the more disposable income you had to have clothes that weren't going to be reused by someone else in the family, for example, the more likely you were to have fitted garments. Fitted clothing was sufficiently expensive to make in terms of the expertise and the time that it would take to do that in the medieval period it was more expensive. When we see more fitted stuff, which we mostly do towards the later end of medieval period, it's generally on more elite people, and then gradually that moves downwards. But yeah, it wasn't like a big overarching, we're going to make these loose fitting robe-like garments because it's gonna be easier to pass it on to our descendants. People in the medieval period, as far as we can tell, generally took a lot of pride and care of their clothing because it represented a huge investment of time and resources. They were definitely trying to make the best clothes that they could. They weren't just going, well, that size fits everyone, so we'll just make that.
That is clearly a robe, okay? It's made to fit a guy, it's a robe. It's my wife's dress, and I'm not kidding. I needed a dress-like thing, and my wife bought several medieval dresses from Arm Street.
We like the shout out to Arm Street. We like Arm Street. Not sponsored, but you know, call me. Robe versus a dress. I'll be honest, the conversation that's happening here sounds a lot just like toxic masculinity run amok, which is obviously you can't call it a dress, a kirtle, a gown, whatever, because it's on a man. That's bullshit. And no. Clothes don't have a gender, and clothes don't change their name because of the gender that's wearing them. That's not how that works. I'm not actually sure what the technical definition of a robe is. I, generally speaking, only call something a robe if it is open all the way down the front, something that you can wrap around you. But as we've established, words for clothes are slippery things and hard to hold on to, so but yeah, that's a dress. You can wear a dress. Of any gender, you can wear a dress, or a kirtle, or a surcoat, or a robe, whatever you want to call it. If you feel like this is an argument you want to have, this is not the channel for you.
It's only when, as things progressed, women more often wore dress-like garments, men less so. And I actually think that perhaps comes down to work, okay? Who's out in the fields working more often? Women worked in the fields as well, a lot in the medieval period. But when it comes to really hard manual labor, guys are the ones who always end up doing that.
Ah, yes. Men wear trousers because manual labor. Okay. This is a thorny subject. Firstly, I think it's important to point out that it is perfectly possible to do a great many things in a dress. Women have always worked, and women have, throughout as much of recorded history as we have, there is evidence of women doing the same jobs men were doing, frequently for less pay and less recognition. And that comes down to, people have this idea that in the history, women were somehow blocked from doing hard labor, like manual work, lifting heavy objects, doing back-breaking labor. That's not actually true. Historically, women have been blocked from work that has pay. The jobs that women have been prevented from doing are the jobs that come with a wage. Were there many builders that were women? No, because that would mean they were earning money. Women worked Women typically worked for less or no recompense. There has always been an expectation that women did work. There just was never an expectation that women would have jobs. There's also this idea that the past was somehow very egalitarian, and if women had been expected to do manual labour, they would of course been allowed to wear less cumbersome garments. That's not how that works. Women were expected to do everything that they had to. They were just expected to do it in a dress because that was the appropriate thing for them to be wearing, and they would be a social outcast and impious, impure, otherwise outcast by society if they did not adhere to the conventional dress of the time. And if you're sat here going, but it would have just been easier to wear trousers, yes it would. Doesn't mean they were allowed to do it. That's a thing that really winds me up. Women were expected to do all the same work, they were just expected to do it in worse clothing.
You were wearing just a shirt, you know, be like wearing a singlet. I would say in the modern day, it's not like people would say, why are you wearing your underwear?
No. Well, maybe. This is one thing that I don't know enough about the medieval period to say one way or another, but I would be cautious about assuming it was okay to go around in your underwear, because it is your underwear in the medieval period. It may have been the case, and I know I've seen a lot of manuscript illustrations of certainly men working in what looks like their shirt sleeves, or sometimes just shirtless and in just their brays. I'm going to keep saying words that I haven't explained. Brays are underpants. We have incomplete and partial evidence as to how prevalent they were and how much they were worn, but it may be much more than we originally thought. For a long time, people maintained that no one wore any underwear at all, it was just the shirt or the shift. But then again, we maintained for decades that medieval women had zero bust support whatsoever, and that's just not true. And also, when you think about it for more than 10 seconds, really impractical. Anyway, I have never seen in a manuscript or otherwise a woman out working in the fields or doing stuff not wearing a kirtle, a dress. I have never seen that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that, as with the modern day, it was more socially acceptable for men doing labour on a hot day to wear fewer clothes, and it was not acceptable for women to do the same. Which isn't to say we never see women in their undergarments in illustrations. We see them in bed, we see them in the bath. Yes, medieval people had baths. That was the thing. There's a lot of images of medieval women in their underwear, just not out and about and interacting with other people or working in the fields, whereas there are images of men out and about in the fields working undergarments, or what looks like their undergarments. Again, these are drawings, not photographs, so artistic license is a thing, we don't know. It's going to take me so long to get through this video.
Now, for a longer, undergarment that is meant to be worn on the skin, that would be called a chemise.
Is it though? Okay. So I did a little bit of research on this, and there is an awful lot of resources that use the word chemise for England in the medieval period. And I don't know enough about the medieval period to say that is definitely not correct. Shad is correct that chemise is a French word, and as far as I know, that was the word that was in use in France. More on that later. My understanding, based on the centuries that come after, is that chemise is not really adopted into the English language until the 19th century. For the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries, it's a shift or a smock. Typically, shift is the most common word you hear, so it's a shift for a woman's garment and it's a shirt for a men's garment. They can sometimes be very similar, they can sometimes be subtly different, normally in length, and neckline is the big one. Yeah, I don't feel great about the use of the word chemise for the English language in medieval period, but I can't actually prove that that's not correct. So, and obviously that is just English and French. Other countries had completely different words. So in Italy, it's a camisia or a camisetta. In the Germanic regions, it's a hemd, I think. The Norse might be smock. Yeah, no, I'm not confident about that one, but there's a word with an exciting combination of consonants in it that I think is the Norse word for the undergarment.
Gown is a gendered word now. We, generally hear
I don't know what that picture is, but it doesn't look medieval. Is this Byzantine? Oh, we're getting into the weeds now.
And the next garment is tunic. Tunic is a very broad term, okay?
Yeah, tunics. Tunics are tunics. There's really not a lot to say about tunics.
Mentioned in the other video, and I said I didn't know how to pronounce it, and I'm very grateful for people sharing with me how it is pronounced. So, the Blion.
Okay. First things first, we are not nitpicking pronunciation. First of all, because that's not an okay thing to do. And secondly, because it really doesn't matter. And thirdly, because this is an extremely old word that is not in modern usage. And aside from the fact that, so Chad and I obviously both speak English as our native language, but we clearly have extremely different regional accents. There are words that I pronounce differently even from the American costubers. I can't really sit there and say, well, one of us is right and one of us is wrong, because this might just be that our accents are different and therefore some things are harder to pronounce in a particular way than another one. For example, it doesn't matter how many times I hear people calling it the Henrican period, I'm always going to say Henrician because my accent doesn't like hard consonants in the middle of words. It never comes out that way. Shad has done exactly what you should do if you are either using an unfamiliar word or if you are unsure about pronunciation of a word, which is he's written it down on the screen and he's shown a picture of what it is he's talking about. That's perfect. That is what you should do if you are, like Shad and I am, in the business of communicating to people on the internet what stuff is about. Having said that, you can't really look at the word bleu written down, and I say bleu, and I don't know if that's right. People are very quick to go, oh, well, it's a French word, so you should pronounce it in a French way. Technically correct? Technically. This word is from the 12th century. They were not speaking modern French back then. How is your Norman French? Because mine's rusty. Much in the same way that people struggle over words in the English language from this period. Like, people struggle over Shakespeare, and that's hundreds of years later. Oh boy, and I just remembered this is pre-vowel shift as well, so God only knows. You can't necessarily look at historical words and say, well, it should be pronounced this way, because quite often with words that are this old, we actually don't know. We can make some very good guesses based on quite a lot of research, and people think of costume history as a soft discipline, and as far as I'm concerned, if you do costume history that's more than about 400 or 500 years old or from a non-European country, you are on hard mode because you have nothing to work with. From a research and archaeology perspective, it's hardcore. You know what's even more hardcore than that? Historical linguists, because you have nothing to go on. There are no sounds. There is no way of ever recording sounds from 800 years ago. Linguists looking at ancient languages and older languages that we don't speak anymore have to go off a whole bunch of really complicated things, and some of it's conjecture and some of it's kind of plausible, and even languages like Latin and ancient Greek have evolved so significantly over history that what we speak now wouldn't necessarily come across as any way intelligible to people 2,000 years ago. I guess what I'm saying is we have some theories about how the word bleu was probably pronounced. We might be wrong. Don't assume that it's pronounced the same way it would be in the modern day.
But there's another garment that this one has a lot of overlap. You could almost call it a bouillon, or this other one.
What is that picture, Shad? That looks like an old reenactment photo from back when they thought that bleus had like a corsety thing on top. We've mostly moved away from that theory now. Some of these photos are a bit weird. Speaking of, is that Isabella? That looks like Isabella from Prior Attire. I really hope he got permission to use those photos.
And that is the hoopland, but they're not detailed enough, and it's hard to find really good information. Then you find conflicting information. They're saying this is a hoopland, but that looks identical to a bouillon, and so there is a lot of clear overlap.
Okay, what is the difference between a bleu and a houppelande? About 300 years, Shad. I'm going to be talking about England because I'm really only qualified to talk about England. The bleu is in fashion from... The research I found gives varying dates, some of them as conservative as like 1150 to 1200, some of them going a little bit longer, so maybe as early as the Battle of Hastings in 1066. I don't really support that with what I've seen, and and as late as the 13th century. Again, I haven't seen a lot of evidence for that. But the blue is very solidly a 12th century thing, maybe a bit longer, probably not. The houppelande is a 14th and 15th century thing, and I'm talking late 14th century too. This is a problem that you get when you flatten the medieval period into one homogeneous lump. It's like 700 years. There's a lot going on. And one of the things is that fashions change. So the blue is an earlier garment, the houppelande is a later garment. In terms of looking at them and going, this is a blue, this is a houppelande, let's talk about what the differences are. So the blue is generally made of lighter fabric. The images and mostly statues that we have indicate that there are many soft folds in the fabric. A lot of effort is put into showing just how many small folds there are. That suggests a lighter fabric. It's also an extremely elite garment, makes silk or very fine wool quite likely. The blue is worn by men and women, and the distinguishing feature that differentiates a blue from a tunic is that the blue tends to have very long hanging sleeves and or a kind of gathered appearance around the body. There is a great deal of debate about how that kind of gathered appearance was done. On women in particular, it seems that they were side lacing. One of the prevailing theories is that they were basically made slightly too tight and too long in the body, and then the side lacing would draw it all up and in, and you'd end up with these fashionable wrinkles going backwards and forwards across the torso. Men's blues that I have seen have been slightly looser and not side lacing. So a men's blue is typically called that because it has the long hanging sleeves. And the long hanging sleeves on a blue tend to be tight around the arm and then have a long pendant at the end, which is different from how the sleeves on a houppelande typically are. My theory on that is it's got something to do with fabric widths, the loom technology that they had, and therefore the weaving width that they could produce. It's much harder to do a houppelande's sleeves on a narrow width of fabric. Trust me, I've tried it in a kimono bolt. You spend a lot of time piecing, but a blue's sleeves you can do in a narrow width of fabric because you've got a tighter sleeve there, and then you can do a separate bit and just curve it in, and that works much better if you have to use narrow fabric. If you've got wide fabric and you can do it all in one, you can do it all in one. None of the things that I have just said are actual historical facts. We don't know. We are working off carvings and pictures and occasional descriptions and a lot of people making stuff up, which is why for a while we thought that the blue had like a corsety thing going on, and you sometimes still see historical and fantasy medieval costumes with this corsety bodice thing, including one of Eowyn's dresses in Lord of the Rings, and that kind of where that idea comes from. Is that was a theory as to how the blue was constructed, and it is a theory we have mostly abandoned. A houppelande is, aside from being several hundred years later, typically perceived to be a heavier garment, so brocades, velvets, heavy wools. It can have dagging, which is a decorative scooply edge on your thing. It can have tighter fitting sleeves or very, very big hanging sleeves, and those very, very big hanging sleeves come in all kinds of shapes, but you often see them with the drop of the sleeve starting from the underarm. Instead of going tight along the sleeve for a bit and down, it goes down from the arm side. Houppelande come in shorter versions, which are only worn by men, and longer versions, which are worn by men and women. Both of these things are outer garments, so you would wear another gown underneath them. But again, what that gown looks like has changed significantly, even though you'd probably refer to both of them as a kirtle. And we'll get onto that in a minute, I'm sure. The big giveaway with the houppelande is that it's not fitted in the body, or it doesn't appear to be fitted in the body. It does also hang in folds, but it hangs in vertical folds from the shoulder. They're typically constructed as a very large garment that is then either the pleats are set in and then it's belted, or it's just belted. The idea that the pleats are set into the garment, not just naturally formed by belting it, is quite a new one, and something that costumers in particular are only just starting to experiment with. The blue, you'll see small wrinkles running across the body this way, and with the houppelande you'll see big thick folds hanging from the shoulders and down. Men typically belt their houppelandes at the waist, and women is usually a bit higher right under the bust. That is what you're going for there. Shad. That is not a medieval garment. That is a bad fantasy costume. Focus up. She's got her shoulders out.
Primary distinction between the blionde and the hoopland compared to the tunic is buttons down the front of it.
Buttons on a houppelande. Buttons on a blue? Absolutely not. Buttons on a houppelande? I've seen them in costuming. I don't know if I've ever seen them in a period source, primary source. Jury's out on that one.
The medieval peasants, they were resourceful, they were industrious, they worked hard. They knew how to work a loom, they knew how to make cloth, and they knew how to sew. They could make clothing that reflected these other styles.
The idea that peasants, because they were making their own clothes, could make more upper class garments doesn't really hold water if you stop and think about it for more than a minute, because defining features of upper class garments was that the fabric was expensive and they used a lot of it. If you're a peasant, you're not going to be able to afford that fabric. You're definitely not going to be able to make that fabric, and you're certainly not going to be able to afford the quantities that you would need. A blue or a houppelande or any other kind of like high status garment throughout the medieval period, lots and lots and lots of fabric. The fact that it's theoretically possible that you would know the techniques to be able to make one doesn't mean that you just could. Why would you? That's so much money and time, and when are you going to wear it? It's not suitable for working on the farm.
It was a more credible source, and this is the thing, I have like long research sessions where I'm reading all this stuff, and even though they were good credible ones, like and sometimes people ask me, Shad, can you share your sources? I'm like, I lost it. I read it, it was good.
Please hold on to your sources, Shad. If you're going to teach people things, you need sources.
One of the medieval kingdoms or countries, might have been in England, France or something, some of the nobles outlawed peasants wearing certain types of clothing so they wouldn't be misidentified as noblemen.
Okay, so what he's talking about are broadly classed as sumptuary laws. And this is actually a thing that possibly can't remember which country it is, because most countries had a crack at some point. And this is not even just restricted to Europe. Most countries had a crack at sumptuary laws at one time or another. So there was continuously a problem of people dressing above their station. This is something that from a modern day we find quite weird, the idea that there would be laws passed about the kind of clothes you could and couldn't wear, but actually historically it was extremely common, whether it was outlawing a certain class of people from wearing a certain kind of clothing, whether it was requiring ethnic and religious minorities to wear a particular kind of clothing, whether it was laws requiring everyone to wear or buy or purchase a certain kind of garment or a certain amount of usually a material that was produced in their country, or higher taxes and some kind of prohibition about buying or wearing clothes made in foreign countries. It is in fact still the case that if you are importing a piece of machinery into the UK, you have to tick a box on the form to say that it is not a jacquard loom. For some reason, that is a thing that I have had to do before on scientific equipment. But Shad is saying that peasants were being mistaken for the noble classes. I don't think he means peasants. I think he means the middle class. We are generally, when we're talking about people who are messing around the boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable as clothing and what isn't legal as clothing, we are talking about people with money and people who don't have titles, and that is generally exemplary tradespeople, merchants, wealthy farmers, middle classes, not peasants. The medieval period didn't break down into the nobility and peasants. There was some stratification going on here. It was complicated, particularly in England. Class was a thing, and still is.
It shows that peasants were absolutely wearing fancy clothing when they were had the means to make it or purchase it, okay? Just because you're a serf doesn't mean you can't get an income.
Okay, just because you're a serf doesn't mean you can't get income. When and where are we talking about? Because it might. Serf is one of those words that doesn't mean one specific thing. It is used for a whole bunch of different classes of people at a whole bunch of different times. There are periods in English history where a serf is a tenant farmer. They're obligated to spend a certain amount of time working their lord's land, and usually that's not actually very much time, and most of the time they are working their own farm, they've got their own income, they're doing okay. They have reasonable freedoms and they can expect reasonable rights from the people they work for within the bounds of the time. There are also times and places in Europe and further afield where being a serf was being an indentured servant. You had very few rights, you had almost no privileges, you were expected to work off a debt, and you might not do that in your lifetime. I got so irate about Russia that camera shut off. So it's not necessarily that just because you're a serf you can't make money is wrong, it's that it might not be right depending on when and where we're talking about. These things mean things.
Okay, there is a type of garment that predates the hoopland, which is very hoopland-like, and that is the herigot.
I've never heard that word before. Okay, so a herigot seems to be a form of garde-corps. The garde-corps as a garment, as far as I am aware, comes after the blue and is kind of a forerunner to the houppelande. It's, as he says, it's an outer garment, heavier fabric. The word garde-corps literally means to guard the body. So there's not a lot of information available on garde-corps, and they're not very popular with costumers. Even adjusting for the fact that the medieval period as a whole is not actually that popular with costumers. It should be. Even when it is, people do the 14th and 15th century or the Vikings, and everything in between is just mud and nonsense. But even adjusting for that, the garde-corps is not very well documented, reproduced. There's not a lot of conversation about it, and my theory for that is it is virtually impossible to Google, because if you search the word garde-corps, you actually find a slightly weird branch of the French military. Oh, there's a link to the page for a herigot on the Wikipedia page for the houppelande. Okay, well, I would hope we're doing slightly more in-depth research than that, but okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with using Wikipedia as a starting point. Their costume stuff is okay, but limited.
There is an incorrect notion that garments across the broad medieval period got shorter as the medieval period progressed.
Non-elite men's clothing got shorter and tighter in general. Women's clothing didn't get shorter or longer. Elite men obviously were still wearing gowns, etc.
These technically are at the very beginning of the Renaissance. And
I reckon we're far enough through the video for me to say something controversial yet brave. The Renaissance isn't real. Okay, let me rephrase that. You cannot say with any absolute accuracy when the Renaissance started. You particularly cannot say that without narrowing down to our country, because Europe doesn't all hit the Renaissance at the same time. Furthermore, I don't think the Renaissance as a period makes any sense whatsoever as like a frame of reference for most subjects, because it's also the case that you can't say when the Renaissance happened unless you know what you're talking about. And in the case of costume history, when we talk about Renaissance fashion as opposed to medieval fashion, what we literally mean usually is the men are wearing doublets and the dresses have a waist seam. Do you see how ridiculous that is? But that's about all we've got to go on as to when does medieval finish and Renaissance start for costume history, and that's happening in different times in different places, and it has absolutely no bearing on art, culture, philosophy, any of the other stuff that's going on, which is all happening at different times. The Renaissance isn't real. We can't use the Renaissance as a fixed point of reference in the way that we can use reigns of specific monarchs. It doesn't work, no.
And that is the tulle and surcoat.
Right, yes, surcoats. I love a surcoat. Oh no, don't do that. Right, where was I? Surcoats! Oh boy, I got so excited about surcoats I had to stop and make another cup of tea. I mean, that and the camera overheated. As a costumer, I tend to use the word surcoat kind of loosely to be any sort of sleeveless or short-sleeved overgarment. Actual medieval surcoats are a little bit more limited, and what counts as a surcoat and what doesn't can occasionally, towards the end of the medieval period, get a little bit fuzzy, but most of them pretty obvious obvious. They are sleeveless, or they have very short, very wide sleeves. There's a whole bunch of subsets of surcoats, like the circlas and other ones, and as Chad mentions, the sideless surcoat. He is entirely correct. The surcoat with the very deep open sides, which can be very, very narrow in the front and back, that is 100% a female garment. That is an elite woman's dress. I, in fact, made one, and it's up there. And go and watch it. Also, you can wear a surcoat over your armour. That's a thing.
Definition, the difference between a surcoat and a kirtle is no sleeves.
Is it a kirtle with short sleeves? Is an argument I'm not wanting to get into.
Kirtle is like your classic, iconic medieval dress.
We kind of blitzed past kirtle. Kirtles are more interesting than made out by that, mostly in that what is a kirtle hugely depends on where you are and when you are. It can be very loose, it can be very fitted, it can have no fastenings, it can fasten up the front, it can be an undergarment, it can be an overgarment, it can be all kinds of things, and yes, we generally in costuming only talk about kirtle as a woman's garment. Particularly in the early medieval period, men are wearing functionally the same thing. Kirtle's a perfectly good word, and kirtle is an English word, and we don't actually get very many of those in costume history. But yeah, kirtles change an awful lot. They generally get more fitted as time goes on and technology evolves. We keep using the word kirtle well into the Tudor period. I think that's about where it ends. And then you're getting into the 17th century, which no one likes since there's no research, so...
That doesn't look like it falls into the perfect categories, and I don't know the name of them. Dresses that were really low cut, that have certain, you know, is it a houppelande? But houppelans tend to be an outer garment. It's got the long sleeves, would you call it a bliant?
Oh boy, okay, let's just really quickly. That is Raphael's Lady with a Unicorn. That is dated to 1505, 1506. I believe that is Florentine fashion. If that is not Renaissance, I don't know what is. If you look for Renaissance women's fashion, that is one of the paintings that will pop up as the archetypal example. Remember that we can't talk about Italian Renaissance women's fashion because Italy wasn't a unified country and the different city-states did not interact as much as you think they would, mostly because of plague, and as a result had very distinct fashion styles, which is why I am really hoping I have not misidentified that as Florentine, because if I'm wrong, they will come for me. That is Jost Haller's St. George slaying the dragon. Yes, that is the dress that Bernadette Banner recreated. One of two things is happening here. So I couldn't find a date for this painting. I could only find a date for when the artist was active, which was 1440 to 1470. I have never seen another gown from 1440 to 1470 that looks anything, well, I don't want to say anything like that. The sleeves are weird. The bodice, fine. The front closure's a bit funky, but the sleeves, I've never seen those like hanging sleeves on a 15th century garment like that. Which means one of two things. Either, this is honestly the one that I support, this dress is at least partially fantastical. Some artistic liberties were taken. It's not necessarily an exact depiction of what people were wearing because it's about St. George. It's an allegory. The other interpretation, which is equally plausible, is that Jost Haller was from Alsace. When we talk about fashion history, we like to go, yes, nice, clear countries doing stuff. Actually, when we talk about fashion history, 99% of the time we are talking about either England or France, and not even all of France or all of England. It's actually like London and Paris. Genuinely, we are that narrowed down. Alsace is one of those regions that has changed hands so many times. It's got its own culture, it's got its own stuff going on, and depending on what the influences were at the time, there is a distinct possibility that they were a little bit doing their own thing. And this is actually true of a surprisingly large number of places in Europe. There's two possible interpretations for this. One, the dress is slightly fantastical, or two, the dress is representative of a particular region that we do not have a lot of primary evidence for and that not a lot of research has been done on. Either way, yeah, that dress is a bit unusual. And this one, I don't actually know what image this is. Just looking at what she is wearing. Looking at the shape of the sleeves, looking at what her headwear is like, the fact that it's fitted with the bodice, but wide cut, and you've got an undergarment, and she's holding up this kind of tawny coloured overskirt to show a more decorative brocade under kirtle. This looks incredibly like the stuff that is in The Queen's Servants from the Tudor Tailor, which is about the end of Henry VII's reign and the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, which is right on the cusp of where English fashion transitions from the medieval full-length one-piece kirtle to the Renaissance or Tudor waist-seam two-piece kirtle. I feel pretty confident sticking that in that time period, and she's wearing a kirtle with a gown over the top. That's what we call that.
The person who gives the most exhaustive comment with good sources of additional garments that I failed to mention in this video, I will pin that comment to the top.
Shad, I expect a shout out. No, I don't. I'm never going to send him this.
So the next one I'll mention is the gambeson.
We're getting into armour and military dress. Military is probably not the word I want, but you know, things that you would wear in combat. This is not my area of expertise, in spite of the fact that I have indeed made a gambeson, but it's very fantasy. Yes, gambesons were a thing. There were also a variety of other things similar to it, and you would need an armourer or an armour expert to talk about the differences between gambesons, padded armour, arming jacks, and indeed just padded doublets that were worn for fashion, because that was also a thing. He's probably right. It probably was that people wanted to wear padded doublets because it made them look like they might be about to put on armour, and that's sexy, right?
Over, it's technically a tunic, you could call it, maybe. I'll call my, tunic thing a bliant over a hoopland.
Shad, honey, sweetie, darling. Okay, so I can't see the neckline, so I can't say for certain, but looks like he's wearing a ghillie shirt. This is a bit of a tangent, but when people started getting into medieval style costuming, whether that was LARP, Ren fairs, the early days of reenactment when people didn't have access to a lot of research, even some films and TV series, there wasn't the same kind of wealth of information and ready-made stuff around. So what people latched onto as this looks old and is readily available and in my size and I can just buy it was European folk costume. We all have that idea of the stereotypical like tavern wench outfit, which is not remotely medieval. It's actually based on Oktoberfest costumes, which are cheap knockoffs of Bavarian folk dress, because that was what was around. And for men, what they latched onto was the ghillie shirt, which is also called a Jacobite or a Jacobean, and that is the casual men's shirt for Scottish traditional folk dress. Again, because it was around, it looked kind of old, it was easy to get hold of, you could just buy it. That's now taken on its own life, so people will call these poet blouses or Robin Hood shirts or even just LARP shirts, I've heard people call them, but originally what they were using and what is now being reproduced is a ghillie. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. We use them for a reason. It's not a blue. If you know anything about European folk dress, they are normally drawing on costume that is 200 to 300 years old at best. Calling the ghillie shirt a Jacobean is honestly a stretch. Also, you can just call things a shirt. If you're not sure, use the modern terminology. That's completely fine, especially when you are in fantasy costuming. If you're not in a reenactment educational setting, just use the modern words. It's okay. No one's going to shoot you for it. We'll know what you mean.
The weird kind of crossover thing between armour and regular clothing, and that is the jupon.
Jupon. It's a kind of surcoat. I'm not going to get in the fine details of that because I don't know what they are. It's a kind of surcoat. There's a Stitch in Time episode about making one. Probably more details in there. I haven't watched a Stitch in Time since it came out because I got mad at it.
What people more often define or identify as a tabard is not a tabard. It's actually what is called a monastic scapular.
I don't want to cast aspersions, but given that we were just identifying a blue and a houppelande as functionally the same garment, it feels a little bit like splitting hairs to then go into the details of the differences between a tabard and scapula. So, scapula are a thing. They do date back to the medieval period. They are indeed usually narrow and full length. They are explicitly a religious garment. Even if you are a secular person wearing one, you are doing so as an act of piety or to show that you are supporting a monastery on a pilgrimage. It's got religious connotations no matter who is wearing it. Also, there are a whole bunch of different shapes, styles, specificities. We've wandered into the weird, dark parts of Roman dress, by which I mean Roman Catholic dress, not Roman Empire dress, not Holy Roman Empire dress, ancient Roman Empire dress, which is different from Byzantine. Oh god, okay. In general, yes, medieval tabards. They are a broad church, they cover a great many different styles, shapes. Some of them have sleeves, some of them don't. In general, he's right, they are shorter and wider. They can be heraldic, they can also be not heraldic. See some really expensive elite garments identified as tabards, which is complicated, but I think it's important to note that tabards are still in use now. Aside from the fact that heraldic tabards are literally still in use by the British monarchy, if you go to a LAR or a historical European martial arts event or a Ren fair and you go, hey, have you got a tabard? We're all thinking of the long, narrow strip of fabric with a hole in it for your head. If you're at a reenactment, different story. It should be accurate to the place, the period, and the status of person that you are portraying. But at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there are living cultures using this word, and just because they are a subculture doesn't mean that they are wrong for using this word, which has evolved to mean a different thing. If you start going around LARP events going, you shouldn't be calling that a tabard, you should be calling it a scapula, well, for starters, we're going to turn around and go, Christianity doesn't exist in this setting, where's your God now? Just roll with it. It's fine. Words evolve. If you're talking about the historical tabard, yes, it should look like that. If you're talking about a modern tabard, it's different. That's okay.
Tabard, I don't know. Anyway, is the ones that the Three Musketeers wore. You know, the
The Three Musketeers is a film from 1993, inspired by a book written in 1844, set in 1625. And that is not a tabard, it's a cassock. Or a cassack. Unclear on when the word changed. We don't have time to get into this right now, but we'll just roll with that's not medieval, that's not a tabard, and nobody ever at any time is allowed to point at any adaptation of the Three Musketeers and use the words historical accuracy. That is not what that is for. Okay.
There are types of jupons that look very much tabard-like.
So we're getting into trying to put hard limits on what is and isn't a certain thing based on what they look like. You can't really do that. You kind of can, but at no point have we identified a place more specific than Europe and a time more specific than the medieval period. If you want to get to the fine splitting hairs of what this word specifically meant or what specific word this garment was called, you need to know a time, you need to know a place, because if you don't, the answer is going to be all of them at some point, at some place, probably. There are some things like the blue where that word doesn't continue, it doesn't get used in other places. Words like surcoat and kirtle and tunic, what those things look like changes so much based on geography and time. You can't sit here and go, this kind of surcoat is a surcoat and this kind of surcoat is a jupon. That's time and place dependent. It's not a unique factor of the clothing itself. This is something that I think people new to costume history really struggle with.
Like these ones that these are portraits of Bavarian dukes that date from like 1505 to 1550.
Having just talked about specific times and specific places, well, we've just established that 1505, 1506 in Italy is definitely Renaissance, even though the Renaissance doesn't exist. But also Bavaria. I don't know anything about the Germanic states. I especially don't know anything about the Germanic states in this period, other than they're really different from everyone else. I've seen the costumes. Again, just going off what I've read, those look kind of like what the Tudor tailor calls a coat. But those are the English words. There's probably a Bavarian word for it. Are we in Landsknecht territory yet? Is Waffenrock still a controversial term? I don't know. When I say that costume history mainly deals with with London and Paris, it becomes incredibly obvious as soon as you step outside of that. As soon as you get away from like the Eurotunnel, things change, and all of a sudden what you knew is no longer fact. I can't help you with Bavarian generals.
If the tunic is getting to about, knee height and it's buttoned up, it's not a tunic. We would call it a cotehardie.
What is a cotehardie? It's a surprisingly good question. What is a cotehardie and what is a kirtle? The usage differs substantially from costumer to costumer sometimes. Again, this may be time specific. I think that actually the words are just kind of entangled at this point and nobody's really sure. There are some kinds of kirtle that are never referred to as a cotehardie. The later fitted kirtle I've seen referred to as a cotehardie. The over kirtle, so something with shorter sleeves, I've seen referred to as a cotehardie. And indeed, the garment that he's showing, a kind of masculine garment with buttons up the front and buttons up the sleeves, quite often gets called a cotehardie. Interestingly, he has latched onto something that costumers are quite aware of, which is that this garment with the buttons up the front and the buttons up the sleeves, there are not very many images of women wearing them. There are some, but there's not very many. They're quite hard to find. There are just enough that we can say that women did wear them sometimes, but there's not enough to draw any overall conclusions from that. And some of the research that I've seen suggests that this is because women were wearing them with another garment on top and men maybe weren't. The shorter buttoned cotehardie we see a lot on men, we see very, very rarely on women. What is and isn't a cotehardie is a thorny subject and one that I have never really bothered to get into in any detail. Just between you and me, I kind of avoid using the word because I'm never certain what garment it actually refers to.
No, it is also medieval, and that is the doublet.
Excellent, we can talk about doublets.
You see doublets, right? I think you could call those robes, and so you could call many types of houppelans, robes.
Those are houppelans, or certainly that man is wearing a houppelande. The woman is wearing something that we argue about whether or not it's a type of houppelande or not. It's typically referred to as a Burgundian, and it depends on who you ask whether it is its own thing or whether it's a style of houppelande.
Full most outer garment that you wear over, say, pants or anything like that, I think you could call those robes.
We're into robes again. In England, towards the end of the medieval period, so like the 15th century, going into the 16th century, it's called a gown, as far as I'm aware. Your terminology may differ based on region and time period.
Either getting the garment short, or if it was long, having a split at the middle to present the codpiece. That's right.
Actually quite glad that he brought up codpieces because people generally are a bit funny about not wanting to talk about codpieces. Costumers get really weird about codpieces. Let's be clear, they're an integral part of the fashion of the period. They do a job, which is to close the gap in the front of your hose, which is important if you're wearing your doublet or whatever short enough that you can see the top of your hose. And I think he actually makes a really good point. I was about to say we don't criticize people for wearing low-cut cleavage revealing dresses, but we do. People are really crap about that, but there's not the same kind of disgust that people have for codpieces. There's nothing inherently obscene about a codpiece. It's a stuffed piece of fabric that you're wearing over your crotch. You can't see anything, it's not revealing anything. We all know it's fake. I don't know, if you don't want to wear a codpiece, don't wear a codpiece. If you do want to wear a codpiece, do. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing inherently weird about them. And they can also be pockets, which is somewhat awkward if you need to get your, change out at the bar. I've seen enough people pull a credit card out of their cleavage that I don't think it would shock me at this point. Okay, let's talk about doublets. Okay, we haven't actually talked about doublets, we've just mentioned that doublets exist. Doublets are really interesting. Doublets probably deserve a video entirely in their own right. They're actually really important. My personal opinion is that the doublet is the point at which men's and women's fashion construction diverges. Late medieval doublets, quite lightweight. As we move through the Tudor period, we're not talking about the Renaissance, doublets get more structured, there's more complexity in their construction, and we start to see the introduction of what's going to become modern tailoring techniques several hundred years down the line. The doublet, again, we're moving into what the Tudors are wearing, and actually all the way down to Elizabethan Tudor. The doublet is one of the first garments that I can point at as fashionable women adopting men's dress fashionably. The doublet doublet bodice in Elizabethan women's wear is a thing, and it's a thing across multiple social classes. It is a thing that was not shocking or transgressive to wear. It was fashionable, even though it was clearly masculine. That keeps happening throughout history, particularly for riding clothes, particularly in times of war, where women will adopt military stylings into their clothing. That's a thing. That's a thing that keeps happening, and it doesn't go the other way. There is never a situation in which men adopt a style of female dress and are not ridiculed and persecuted for it. Which isn't to say that there's not backlash against women for wearing masculine styled clothing. There kind of is, but it happens anyway. Honestly, I could talk about doublets for literally forever. They're really cool, but they are generally more of a Renaissance thing than a medieval thing. They appear right towards the end, and medieval doublets are less structured, less complex in general, do seem to evolve out of things that you would wear under armour or to attach armour to, but it's not as straightforward as everyone was wearing armour and therefore started wearing doublets. They just look good, and if the codpiece discussion wasn't enough to give you the hint, the medieval period going into the Tudor period in England was very concerned about men looking good.
But what I'm referring to is the jerkin. The surviving jerkin we have is this one right here, and it dates to the Renaissance.
There's a pattern for that exact jerkin in Patterns of Fashion 3. I think it's 3.
I think that's everything. Everything that we've mentioned. I actually suspect there are more classic, identifiable medieval garments that I've missed.
Any that he's missed. Shad, my dude, trousers. I don't quite know why we haven't talked about trousers, given that he's referenced trousers a lot in this video, but we haven't actually talked about them. So let's talk about trousers. So there's two main styles of trousers in the medieval period, and trousers is not a contemporary word. It is a modern word for leg garments. You get the earliest style of trousers, which you've probably seen if you've ever seen any Viking reenactors, but they were a bit more widespread than that. What these are called is hugely time and region specific. Some people call them braccae, which is the Roman word for it. Ancient Roman Empire, not Holy Roman Empire, not Catholic Roman. You also see them called brugae or brugae or brugau or some variation on these, depending on which Keltoi language is being horribly mangled at the time. I'm so sorry to my ancestors. They are looser fitting. They are either knee length or ankle length. They will be tight fitting at the knee or ankle. If they are knee length, they are definitely worn with some kind of legging or leg wrap below the knee. If they are ankle length, they can be worn with some kind of legging or leg wrap. You will identify medieval trousers very easily when looking at different kinds of historical trousers because of their construction method, which is they don't really have a shaped crotch. They have a width of fabric for the crotch, and then they have two tubes at either side, and you cinch it all in. They are super baggy at the top and more fitted lower down on the leg. That's one type of medieval trouser. Generally earlier, generally further north. The other type of medieval trouser that you see coming in later, and you will have seen lots of images of in this video, is if you're seeing a tightly fitted pair of trousers, in particular if they're a tightly fitted pair of what looks like a pair of tights, that is hose. Kind of not really trousers, it is a pair of socks that join at the top. That's a terrible explanation. Hose is actually really interesting, and it's a really beautiful garment when done well. Hose can also just mean socks, things that come to below the knee, just above the knee. Socks worn by women, socks worn by men, but what we're talking about here is the full-length hose, which go all the way to the waist. These are only, as far as I am aware, worn by men. They're not knitted, they are made of woven fabric. I have only ever seen people make these by fitting on the body of the person they are intended for and cutting them on the bias. So this is a very time and fabric intensive process. They usually have a seam around the foot and then one seam running all the way up the back of the leg, usually joined at the back, and then the front they are open, and that's where your codpiece goes. Full-length hose are great and are one of those things that you don't see very much of in costuming, generally because people who identify as men in in modern society are not as used to wearing very tight, very revealing clothing around that part of their body. And again, that's something that I think is a real shame. Because they are so structured, it's not like wearing a pair of tights. They are actually gonna smooth everything out, hold stuff up. If you fit them right, they're gonna be a little bit hard to move in, but they can make your legs look great. That's a massive oversimplification, but broadly those are the two kinds of trousers that you are going to see in the medieval period, is the brogai, braque, whatever you want to call them, the Viking trousers, and hose. And there are of course the trunk hose and all the puffy variations, but I'm going to commit those to the Renaissance, which doesn't exist, so I don't have to talk about them. Oh my god, I think I'm finally done. What have we learned? Clothing is difficult, fashion history is surprisingly hard, and Wikipedia should be the start of your journey, not the end. But also, I hope that everyone has learned that fashion history is really fun, it's really interesting, there's a lot of good nitty-gritty bits to get your teeth into, and medieval costume in particular is a little bit neglected and a little bit overlooked because everyone gets very excited about the Victorians and the 18th century, and going that much further back is kind of difficult. You're dealing with a lot less certainty, there's a lot less information available, you're going to have to make stuff up, which means that you might get stuff wrong, and most of what we now believe about medieval clothing is because of 20 or 30 years of reenactors, LARPers and SCA members getting stuff wrong. I actually think that's really cool and really interesting. I'll also be honest, we have come a long way to the point that a channel that is mainly devoted to weapons and armour and boy stuff is willing to talk about costume history at all. Historically, these kind of spaces have gone, well, that's just girl stuff and it's not important. And that's obviously not true and really doesn't recognise just how complex and interesting a subject it is. So I'm really glad that Shad made this video, and I really hope it serves as a starting point for him to go on and learn more about costume in the medieval era and just how much we don't know about medieval clothes. I hope you've all enjoyed this video. I would like to promise that it will not be 5 weeks until the next one, but I don't make promises I can't keep, so in the description box below you will find a link to my Ko-fi page. There you can make a one-off donation to support the channel. At the moment I have a goal which is for my field LARP project. I'm hoping to get the first video of that up quite soon. It's going to be a bit of a mini series taking you through how you build a wardrobe for a character that you're going to take out into the elements and camping and fields and mud and all the good difficult stuff. Definitely going to contain some historical elements, almost certainly going to contain more medieval clothing because boy do LARPers love their medieval fantasy. I'm also in the background working on a whole bunch of vintage fancy dress costume patterns. I'm going to do a bunch of making of videos in October because it's my favourite month, and anyone who donates £10 or more on Ko-fi, I will put their name in a video as a special thank you because your support is really very much appreciated. It is late, I am tired, and England, Italy is into extra time, so that's all from me folks, and I'll see you next time.